All right, good evening, Melbourne. Thank you so much to Padma and the other organisers for putting this all together. I know it's been a lot of work, and just being along for the ride has been really fun so far. And good evening, Melbourne. Thank you all so much for coming. I kind of feel like Melbourne is like a second home for me because I'm here I find excuses to come here at least twice a year, whether it's for like CSS Conf or JS Conf or whatever it is. I'm always down in Melbourne if I can help it, and I feel like that's partly because Melbourne has like such a good community of developers and also a lot of Perth expats, which is great. And maybe one day I'll be one too. No, I'm staying in Perth forever, Padma, just so you know. Anyway, tonight I'm here to talk to you about what I'm calling the less glamorous elements of design. But first things first, hi there. I'm Brett, as Padma mentioned. And also as Padma mentioned, well, first of all, I've got a request. For anyone who knows any good coffee, brunch, donut places, please send them to me at Brett J. I like to think of myself as like a person who loves brunch and stuff like that, and I've been to like Wide Open Road and Hardware Society more times than I can count, but I really need new options, so I'm counting on you and Broadsheet to tell me where to go. So please send any suggestions you have to me. Thank you. Anyway, as Padma mentioned, I work at a company called Pin Payments, and as Padma also mentioned, sorry, I also helped to co-organise Mixin last year, which was a great conference, kind of inspired from many awesome conference experiences at places like CSS Conf and JS Conf. So that's kind of me in an elevator pitch. But anyway, we're here tonight to talk to you. So I'm so glad that joke landed because Padma talked about the keynote clicker thingy. That completely ruined that joke. So thank you for that. That validated it was a good joke. I knew it. Anyway. Anyway, we're here to talk tonight about the less glamorous elements of design. But what do I mean by that? Well, I don't mean clients from hell that don't understand why we don't want to make their logos bigger. Nor am I here to kind of rant at you about the so-called dribbleization of design. Well, not exactly, okay? So there are a lot of different kinds of designers, right? But within our own industry specifically, I feel like there's this kind of palpable sense of nervousness and anxiety and uncertainty. And it's not just when you're giving talks, it's also kind of when there's a lot of different expectations placed on your role, right? So who's seen this great philosophical question of our decade posited by the greatest thought leaders on Medium and Twitter? It's quite easy to make a mockery of, as seen here. But to me, these questions, which should we code, should we prototype, should we wireframe, should we use a test? All these differing, in varying forms of sincerity, I think the core questions that keep on coming up time and time again do sort of indicate to me that there are really fragmented expectations around what designers in our industry should do. And why is that though? I mean, well, there are various roles, right? Okay, so here are some that exist today. Next week, there'll be new ones to add to your LinkedIn portfolio. But I look at the terminology and the overlap in some of these roles and the repetition in some of them, and I wonder if it has to necessarily be this way. I think it's good that there are specialist roles and we have labels that can kind of identify areas to specialize in, but I also wonder if perhaps it's part of the problem. Perhaps the fragmentation of roles is actually just a symptom, and perhaps there's something behind it. Could it be like the fragmented education we experience in our industry? Because I do think that our industry is largely self-taught. It's kind of just the nature of the sort of work we do, because our industry moves fast, which in turn also kind of changes expectations and ideas about what we do on a very frequent basis. And the existing fragmentation of roles as we enter the industry further compounds the problem, because depending what box you're assigned when you enter the industry, you may sort of be funneled into learning certain things, but miss out on other things that could be crucial or useful to your growth as a designer or whatever you want to call yourself. This probably applies to more fields than just designers, to be honest. So I think these three things are kind of key reasons why we have this sort of anxiety and uncertainty about sort of like what it is we should be doing and kind of looking over our shoulders at what other designers are doing. And I want to talk about all these in a bit more detail, starting with our industry being largely self-taught. Now, I went to university in Perth. Maybe the universities in Melbourne are better, I can't tell. Like there's RMIT, I walked past that once, that looked kind of cool, it had a nice building. Anyway, I do feel like the curriculums that were sort of taught aren't always relevant for the work we do. I felt that way a number of years ago, God, quite a few years ago when I went to university. And I do think that that could be even a worse problem today with just the nature of how fast things in our industry tend to move. But that's not really a fault of the institutions. Our industry moves very fast. Now, often I hear in defense of universities and tertiary education is that, well, it's more about instilling a sense of self-learning, and that's more important than any given curriculum. And I think that's true to a certain extent, but I also think that without a relevant curriculum, we have no guide for what to actually sort of learn. And then you're sort of left to your own devices to figure it out for yourself. How do you learn and what do we learn? And then you sort of have to follow your gut, your instinct, and sort of like trust that you can find what it is you need to learn about. So the problem with that is that with design, there are things that you know, and this applies to a lot of things, I'm sure, but there are very easy things to appreciate you don't know. Very technical design skills often, like being good at illustration or sort of typography or good layouts and stuff like that, like very technical design skills, which are very easy to appreciate, even to outsiders, to form a view on that's good design. But the more insidious stuff is the things that don't necessarily have an artifact in the final product after a design team has finished the process. You coming into the industry don't necessarily know about these things from what you see on Dribble or Facebook or wherever you get your design sort of insights. And deciding what you learn should be a sort of deliberate decision, right? But you cannot make an informed decision without all the information. That's how you end up sort of missing things that could be a really good skill to cultivate that would help you kind of grow. And so I've been talking in abstract a little bit, so I'm going to use myself as a case study and talk about how I learned. And it kind of goes back to Dribble. Now, I did say this was not going to be a rant on the dribbleization of design. And I stand by that because I really love this stuff. This is what got me into the industry. I wouldn't be standing in front of you now talking about design if not for like the sort of visual glamorous stuff that we see on sites like Dribble and Behance and everywhere else. I think this stuff is great, and typography, all that, I could talk about that a lot more than I'm going to tonight. Well, actually, it was more like user bars and Windows Media Player skins and Winamp skins and OG Web 2.0 graphics that really got me excited back in the day. And so at the time, I sort of like set about learning it. So here's a dramatization of me trying to learn to be a designer one afternoon after school. I booted up my Windows computer, got some messages from a friend after school, went to Firefox and searched something a bit like this, like how to Photoshop glossy buttons really good like, or something like that. This is as best to my recollection is what happened. And then I found like some sort of 15-step PSD tutorial, which made me a certified designer. It taught me everything I need to know about the industry. It was great. That contract selection feature in Photoshop is the killer feature for gloss. I mean, I don't know how well it works in high DPI environments, but very important for me then. Now, of course, you spot the problem immediately. And it's a bit of an exaggeration, but the point I'm trying to make is that Google is only a great way to learn if you already know what you need to learn. So I appreciated very superficial qualities of design, but there was so much more that I was not even aware of from how I entered the industry. Enter Jesse James Garrett. Now, is anyone here familiar with his work at all? Yep, see a few hands going up. Perfect. Cool. Okay, so Jesse James Garrett is a co-founder of Adaptive Path and has written a number of books on the topic of user experience, including the elements of user experience. Now, I became a lot more familiar with his work at Pin Payments when we decided to make our design process a bit more explicit and not so implicit and sort of like up to the devices of whoever's doing the button today. And so it all kind of begins with this very kind of complex looking diagram that Jesse produced about the elements of user experience. And I just want to start with a quote. The web was originally conceived as a hypertextual information space, but the development of increasingly sophisticated front and back-end technologies has fostered its use as a remote software interface. This dual nature has led to much confusion as user experience practitioners attempt to adapt their terminology to use cases beyond the scope of its original application, which in other words is, hey, sometimes we design websites and sometimes we design apps, and the process is slightly different depending on which we're designing. Now, I'm here talking to you in 2017, we all know that. But I think what's really interesting about this diagram and all the sort of content on it is that this was actually written in 2000, about 8 years before the iPhone had an app store, about 7 years before the iPhone even existed, about 5 years before the Facebook, and 3 years before MySpace. And so many of the modern products we consider as the hallmarks of modern product development and design, this sort of diagram predates a lot of it, and it still has a lot of relevant information on it. Now, I could spend an entire talk on this particular slide. It's very dense, but you sort of have the different sort of faces going up, and sort of like it gives you a process and also the sort of curriculum that you could use to sort of learn more about this sort of stuff. Now there's a simplified version of this which kind of goes from the strategy layer through to the surface layer, and each step sort of like defining another part of the process. And looking at this simplified version, I can notice a few things. Like for one thing, I do think that there's this trend towards very specialist skills in the top level. You could be a very like specifically good illustrator or letterer or something like that in the surface layer, but then sort of the bottom layer where you're sort of defining a strategy for your business is more of a generalist skill. Like it may not be a good or measurable goal, but most people can kind of set out with a strategy. And I think there's like a natural correlation between the specialist versus, I agree. Anyway, sorry. So I think there's a natural progression for many designers, at least this is how I enter the industry, so that sort of example before where I sort of Googled around for how to design pretty buttons in Photoshop. I feel like there's a natural progression for designers to sort of be attracted to the industry at the surface layer, which is very superficial, and only once they actually enter the industry and start to gain experience, they start to see the importance of the more fundamental underlying natures of design, which are not necessarily quite as visible. For me, the structure layer, for example, was entirely invisible to me as a designer starting out until I actually got into the industry. Now on this more complicated version of the diagram, Jesse refers to these tasks as interaction design and information architecture. And he also has a relatively useful framework for that, which he calls the visual vocabulary. Now you look at this and you go, oh, well, that's like a sitemap, right? And sort of. It's much more comprehensive than just like a sitemap, though. It has a lot of different symbols and that represent the state and the lots of different conditions based upon the user's journey. And so basically it's a vocabulary for visualizing a user's journey through an application or a website in a very efficient manner. Now I think this is kind of an interesting technique that gets overlooked a lot and doesn't get talked about much in design circles that I kind of was part of as I kind of got into the industry. It requires no technical design skills, quite crucially. So it doesn't matter if you're really good at Photoshop or really bad at Photoshop. There's no arbiter to being able to be a part of this process, right? It's a visual vocabulary that you can actually learn like a language like any other, which makes it a very inclusive design process. So suddenly developers and other stakeholders, project managers, they can all, if they are interested in sort of learning this vocabulary or something similar to it, can sort of reason about the design and contribute their perspective without necessarily feeling like there's a barrier to entry that doesn't welcome them because they can't push buttons around in Photoshop or whatever we're using today. And this may set off red flags. Are we designing with committee? And I don't really think about it like that. I think it's more about designing with greater context and with more perspective, because ultimately it's still the designer's sort of responsibility to synthesize the different sort of stakeholder points of view and sort of try and work out the best compromise from the different sort of areas. But I think that it just informs your process and makes it more robust when you are able to have more diverse perspectives look at a flow than just sort of trusting either a team of people with a very similar perspective or an individual whose perspective is sort of being trusted without things like obviously user testing and stuff like that. And it allows you to make design sort of decisions much more efficiently than in a visual design tool. And at the right fidelity, I think it encourages, it also encourages the right fidelity. So for example, I might be in a visual design tool of some description. It might be Sketch this week or Figma or something. And I might be making a decision, like I might be in Sketch or whatever it is, and suddenly I'll start to consider more of the high level flow. And what I should really be doing is sort of jumping away from a visual design tool and having a few iterations over it, pen and paper, maybe speaking to some other people involved in the team, developers and that sort of thing, sort of like get all the perspective and sort of map out the structure, have a few goes over it because it's very quick to just draw boxes and arrows. But you might be thinking, hey, we've got these cool design tools like Sketch and Framer and they allow us to do really fast rectangles these days. It's not like Photoshop, it's much faster. And indeed, just last week, Framer unveiled the new design update to Framer. And I love that they've also kind of solved that problem of should designers code with a very elegant segmented button control in the middle of their interface. We have our answer. Anyway, I love Framer, the product, and they've got so many talented people and I love what they're doing. But I do think that there's still like drawbacks to starting at this kind of level of fidelity, right? So unless you're designing something as rote as a messaging interface or a weather application or something where we very much understand the flow of it because it's like two screens, the problem is sort of that you're designing at this kind of level when there is an opportunity for you to zoom out, not focus on all the details and sort of have a few iterations over the flow before you even zoom that far in and start getting in the weeds of the details of the micro interactions. This encourages you to focus on the bigger picture allows you to iterate over it quicker, and crucially, it's easier to throw away. So you don't spend 60 hours in a design tool or whatever it is, and then sort of like get invested in it and then have to throw it away, or potentially worse, not throw it away if there are sort of improvements to be made. Julie Zuhl, a product designer at Facebook, wrote, or rather more correctly, drew a series of really interesting comparisons between junior and senior designers. And one of the illustrations she showed, which I thought was quite entertaining, was this comparison of the process of a junior designer versus the process of a senior designer. And if you can't read it, she describes the junior designer's process as like following a hyperactive green fairy. And on the right, we have a much more methodical, deliberate sort of process that sort of like eliminates things that are dead ends and sort of like makes its way through to the final product. And it's interesting because I kind of feel like anytime I'm trying to make a high level product decision and I'm doing it while I'm like, it might be about the navigational flow of a website or whatever it is, and I'm sort of like pushing pixels in Sketch or whatever, and I'm trying to make high level decisions, and I'm kind of like sort of like going between those layers. It feels very much like I'm working in a very roundabout fashion, a bit like a junior designer. And I must stress, I'm not here to sort of prescribe any process. I think that it's good not to be dogmatic about this, and there is no one sort of size fits all solution. It always depends on what you're doing. And I also wouldn't prescribe a process that potentially looks so waterfall-like, but I do think that by adding some structure to the sort of process, you kind of inform it and make it a bit more robust and allow you to sort of make more consistent, reliable results and make it more repeatable. Now, you may be listening to this and you may think, oh, this is great, but it's not really my job. Like, maybe you don't consider yourself a designer, and that's fair enough. But maybe you're a designer and you're like, actually, that's cool, but I just want to do illustration or whatever. And I actually think that's fine. I think that it should just be a conscious decision that you sort of are aware of it and you don't want to sort of specialize in it. Because I think the problem is when it comes to things like the less glamorous elements of design, it's not something that's necessarily talked about as much in our industry, because it's not like glamorous or fun to talk about. Nice buttons and stuff like that are much more entertaining to sort of talk about. But as for the existing fragmentation of roles, Jonas Downey, a designer at Basecamp, recently wrote an article entitled "The Unnecessary Fragmentation of Design Jobs," and he makes this point about why do we like to box ourselves into very specific roles and things like that. And in it, he says, if you're only focused on examining problems, you aren't empowered to dream up proper solutions. And if you're only focused on dreaming up solutions, you're not close enough to the ground level truth. And if you're only focused on the nitty-gritty implementation, you know a lot about the what, but not a lot about the why. So in other words, designing with context is a good thing. Indeed, when it comes to things like user experience, I do find it hard to separate from the other aspects aside from like the very specific user research roles, which is handy that I got this Sebastian DeWitt tweet to remind me that this is the difference between UX and UI, because otherwise I'd totally forget. But I think that at the end of the day, user experience should be everyone's concern. When I make a nice looking button that has some sort of intangible benefit on the user experience, when someone like Glenn Madden makes sure that an application works in a high latency network environment, that has a profound impact on the user experience. And so we should, the sooner we acknowledge that no one's the arbiter of user experience and that everyone has a role to play in contributing to it, the sooner we can sort of like kind of make sure our process is more inclusive and includes more perspectives to inform our work and make the results stronger. Indeed, designers I really respect and admire sort of have similar thoughts about adding more additional perspectives and experience to the kind of core competency and adjacent skill set to sort of make their solutions a bit more robust, because they've kind of got a few more different experiences along the way. I don't like to think of processes as sort of silos that don't overlap, because I think that ultimately the areas of overlap and intersection are where the interest and value really lies. When you're able to see a problem from more than one perspective, you can start to see new opportunities and insights. Now, all this new homework, I don't want to give you full stack anxiety or anything like that. That's a much better talk by Joel Khalifa, plug, which you should totally watch if you're sort of like struggling with what you should prioritize in learning, because Joel gives a really good framework for sort of deciding what to learn and being okay with deferring the rest, because obviously there are only so many hours in the day. You won't necessarily be able to learn everything. But I do want to leave on a note of optimism. I've said repeatedly that our industry moves fast, and I do think that's true. Anyone that's tried to learn JavaScript in 2016 or insert current year here, it's a funny joke always now, will agree with me. Thank you. But then I look at the work by Jesse James Garrett and I see how much value and insight it still can hold in 2017. Something that's nearly 20 years old is still quite relevant in an industry that moves quite fast. And that brings me to my final point about fundamentals and fashion. When it comes to things like less glamorous elements of design, Sure, the surface layer is very sort of glamorous and it's very exciting and exhilarating. I still love keeping up with all that stuff. But when it comes to figuring out where to sort of like focus your limited time and attention, I think there's this natural correlation between the cadence of change in each of these layers, well, specifically the top three. And I feel like at the surface layer, things move really fast all the time. But I feel like deep down a few layers, the fundamental stuff that we've sort of taken for granted for a few years has remained largely unchanged since we've been designing for screen-based interfaces. Our understanding of it's gone better, but we haven't necessarily, necessarily appreciated as much. Golden Krishna wrote a book recently entitled The Best Interface is No Interface, where he posits that perhaps we've become so infatuated with screen-based user interfaces, we've become blind to opportunities that exist beyond the screen. Indeed, with chatbots, vocal AI assistants, and the Internet of Things finally arriving this year, I've been hearing about it at conferences for years now. There may be a time when paradigms do shift, or whatever that term is, and we're designing solutions for problems that don't involve a screen. And even in that case, the humble box and arrow will still be able to sort of be a useful tool for us to sort of solve these problems. So that's the less glamorous elements of design. If you found anything I had to say interesting and you'd like some further reading, you can find more at Brett Cool Talk. Thank you. And yeah, on to Glenn.